Concerns over energy supplies are mounting around the globe as the U.S. and Israel's war on Iran sends oil prices soaring. The Strait of Hormuz, a key shipping lane for oil from the Gulf, has been effectively shut down by the conflict. The U.S. says it's working to keep the strait open, but Iran has vowed to limit the number of ships that can pass through until the war ends.
The U.S. military strikes targets in the Strait of Hormuz. It says it destroyed over a dozen Iranian ships used to lay mines in the strategic waterway. Iran says a maritime ambulance was among those hit. Since the outbreak of this war, a fifth of the world's oil has been effectively blockaded behind the Strait of Hormuz. Iran says it will not let ships through until U.S. and Israeli attacks cease. Some ships have managed to navigate the dangerous waterway, but others have come under fire. At least 3 commercial ships were hit in the Gulf on Wednesday. Iran has taken responsibility for 2 of those attacks, including on a Thai cargo ship, the Mauri Nari. Iran has repeatedly struck out at its Gulf neighbors, with strikes on transportation and oil infrastructure. The strategy is squeezing the oil market, making the war ever more costly for the US and Israel to continue. Unable to achieve their shifting war goals using air power alone, US and Israeli leaders have repeatedly called on the Iranian people to rise up and overthrow their government. Iran's national police chief has made the regime's response clear.
If someone comes out onto the streets at the enemy's behest, we will no longer consider them protesters or anything of the sort. We will regard them as the enemy, and we will treat them as we treat the enemy. All our team have their fingers on the trigger.
The main parties in this war are deadlocked. The US and Israel say they will not negotiate. Iran says it will not negotiate. All the while, the costs in resources and lives continue to soar.
Let's bring in Justin Crump here. He's a British Army combat veteran and CEO of Sibyl-line. That's a strategic risk and intelligence consultancy based in London. Thanks for being with us. Justin, a week and a half into this war, where do you see things right now? What's your top-line assessment of how the war is going?
I think actually very much as you just reported. I think that put it very well and better than most in terms of calling out what's really happening here. The US and Israel are obviously doing an awful lot of damage from the air. They're achieving great operational success. They are striking targets across Iran. They are definitely reducing Iran's ability to launch ballistic missiles and drones and things like that, especially compared to the first day of the conflict. But that's not enough to achieve the aims that they've set out, even after some confusion about what the aims were for a long period of time. The latest aims that have been put forward are still going to be very, very, very hard to do purely with bombing. And I think that hope that the Iranian people would rise up, as some may have tried to do in January, and they would do that again, and they would clear out the regime, and this would be almost Venezuela again, with a rapid regime change enabled, doesn't seem to be coming to pass. So you are stuck in this situation now with the Iranians very much led by the IRGC, now the hard line, digging in, willing to take the fight to the US and Israel, willing to expand the fight across the region, willing to use new tactics, and effectively fighting almost at the moment a maritime insurgency as well in Hormuz, or the start of one, the threat of one, knowing the cost they can impose on the US, and that's their way of responding to the operational success, is a strategic threat against eventual victory.
What would you say are Iran's greatest assets in this war? What could allow it to keep on fighting and defy the ongoing efforts to topple the regime?
I mean, it comes down to the will of the majority of the IRGC, in particular Basij and others, to support the regime. And we shouldn't ignore the religious aspect here, especially when these attacks were launched during Ramadan. The appeal of martyrdom maybe to some of the IRGC and others, that willingness to lay down their lives for the regime. And actually that is something that's been made more simple. Iran had dreadful economic problems, had terrible water problems in Tehran. Well, no one's talking about that now because they're trying not to be bombed and just to survive. And you saw the same say in Gaza, where despite the attacks on Gaza and the operations in Gaza, the people did not clear Hamas out. They were too concerned with their own welfare. So that actually helps the regime in many ways consolidate power. It's probably fractured, power is getting more distributed, but life in some ways is simpler during a war. And I think that helps them persist. And in terms of tactics, they don't have to fire huge waves of ballistic missiles. They don't have to mount spectacular attacks on other countries. They just have to keep enough coming. And it's not the number of missiles, it's the impact it has on lives, on life in the Gulf, on the entire area, on maritime trade. It's the impact they're having that is actually asymmetric to the effort put in compared to what the US and Israel have to do. And it's that imbalance that potentially works in Iran's favor. They can bring long-term pain for comparatively little expenditure.
So how can Israel and the U.S. bring about the changes they are looking for in Iran without leaving the country in a state of chaos with potentially disastrous implications for stability in the region?
I mean, this was the challenge. Basically, we've heard about three-day wars quite a lot. We've talked about them between ourselves quite often on this program since 2022. You do have these problems where you go for something, there's a window of opportunity. I think there was a realistic hope amongst many that actually striking would enable the Iranian people to rise up. And I think that objective is being lost because they're not taking advantage of that. And the more the war continues, the more the Iranian people are suffering. There is no doubt of that. And of course, the IGC and the regime get to blame that more and more on the Americans and the Israelis for doing the bombing. So, that window therefore lost. You say it is therefore bogging down. And you now have that risk of actually, if Iran does collapse, there isn't really cohesion there. There aren't really any clear parties that would take over. It's a country with many ethnicities anyway. So it isn't very clear how that would manifest. Would it be Libya, which fractured under similar circumstances for an air campaign?
Right.
Would it look like Syria? But in any way, it's not good for the Gulf.
Now, you're someone who looks at how various crises feed on one another, how the economic and security realms interact. What do you see as the main risks associated with this war moving forward?
I mean, I think markets are really quite surprisingly underreacting to the scale of what is unfolding and could potentially unfold. I think just in the scale of what we're living with in the last few years compared to how many of us have lived our lives, certainly since the end of the Cold War, there's a huge amount of change, there's a huge amount of risk and threat that's evolving, and actually it's comforting to sort of think, well, it must go back to normal. I'm afraid that actually this sort of level of uncertainty probably is normal for us now, certainly through the rest of this decade. And one might argue that Russia did not help that 4 years ago, of course. And all of these things are intertwined, as you mentioned. And in fact, Russia's position on Ukraine may well be something that's traded off as part of trying to mitigate what happens in the Gulf. So it's not just about the region, it's about the world. But for markets, oil is seriously affected. Fertilizer is affected. Everything upstream of energy is affected. Now, we're lucky that energy prices were low going into this. But every day that goes on is probably another week of disruption. And that's going to take a long time to wash through. It's going to affect all aspects of our lives, our cost of living, and in small ways at first, and then more and more. Plus, of course, risk of things like refugee crisis. People are being allowed to leave Iran. Where are they going to come? This is not a topic that Europe has enjoyed dealing with over the last decade. So more of that is going to put more pressure on our lives.
Justin, thank you very much for your insights. That was Justin Crump, CEO of the risk consultancy Sibyl-line.
Now let's have a bit of a deeper dive into this whole mess with Fabrice Pothier. He's a defense and security analyst who has worked with NATO before, and he's also currently CEO of the political consultancy firm Rasmussen Global. Fabrice, the Strait of Hormuz seems to be playing the major role now in this war. Walk us through why it is so crucial.
Well, actually, paradoxically, the Strait of Hormuz is mostly crucial for Asian economies, because a large part of both LNG gas exports and oil exports that are transiting through the strait are destined to go to economies like China, Japan, and others. However, obviously, if there's a choke point on a large part of global oil and gas export, this increased quite dramatically the price of gas futures and oil price. And as a consequence, is putting pressure on other economies, including in Europe and in the United States.
Now, who's got control of the area at the moment? Is it Iran, and how tight is its grip there?
Well, it's hard to say, but they clearly have some capabilities that are still operational in terms of mining, which is fairly easy given the shallowness of the water there. So Iran still has a card to play in that part of the region. The question is whether the US and Israel, but mostly the US, will go faster enough to basically disable Iranian mining and operational capabilities to basically close or constrain dramatically access to and from the Strait of Hormuz.
Now, there's been a lot of back and forth lately about whether US or allied warships could actually escort commercial shipping through the strait. Why is that such a headache?
We have had in the past some missions in counter-piracy, for example, where both European and American navies were kind of escorting some of the commercial ships transiting in the broader region. So I don't think it would be completely impossible, but obviously it raises a question of A, having available capabilities to do so, and B, be willing to take risks, because Iran still has clearly a capacity to inflict pain and destruction, as we saw on some of the commercial ships that probably hit some mines over the past few days. So whoever will step in, being a European coalition or broader coalition, will have to be willing to take to see some of their capabilities to be put at risk.
Now, oil prices have stabilized a bit after President Trump signaled the war could wrap up quite soon. Do you see this ending anytime soon?
I cannot predict when and how it will end, but clearly there's a clock ticking, at least a political clock ticking for Donald Trump, given the nervosity of his base, especially the MAGA base. And remember that we are in a pre-election campaign mode in the United States, and Trump is quite unpopular. So there's this political clock ticking back home, which is the reason why both him and his defense secretary have been hammering the kind of quite surrealistic message that A, they have won, and B, it's almost over, which is not what you hear from other analysts, and including even from the Israelis, who are setting it for a campaign of at least few more weeks to be able to fully cripple and disable the Revolutionary Guard's capabilities. So I think there's this clock ticking. And then on the Iranian side, there's obviously also the clock ticking of how many missiles and drones they can still throw at Israel, America, and also the Gulf allies. And even though they have still been able to launch some counterattacks and strikes across different targets, clearly the rate of those missiles and drones have decreased quite substantially. So there might be a point where Iran will no longer have the means to actually respond to the US-Israeli operation. And that will be a bit the chess moment in this operation. But who reached that point first is really what we are looking at now.
Now, if we're looking at what you just mentioned, the attacks especially at US allies in the Gulf region, firing rockets and drones at these countries, is that a clever strategy from Iran, do you think?
Well, on one hand, clearly they have pushed many of these allies, Gulf allies of the United States, to be playing a more active role in supporting the US-Israel operation. So in that sense, this was quite counterproductive from that point of view. However, it was a way to escalate the war, and because at the end, they don't have an enormous amount of targets to go after when it comes to the US, but also Israel, even though they have been obviously aiming for Israeli cities, but the Israelis also have a capable defense, which is not the case of Gulf countries with very large infrastructure, Qatar, the LNG infrastructure, the Emirates with pretty important first city infrastructure, but also data centers that are completely unprotected. So I think it was a way to escalate and spread the conflict and create some kind of pressure back on the US, to basically political pressure to be at some point calling it an end and de-escalate.
Fabrice Pothier there from Rasmussen Global. Thank you very much for your insight.
Pleasure.